the Holy Crusade against ASIC. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hi, John.
Hello, sir. How you going?
Yeah, pretty good. Interesting times.
Indeed. So we're recording today on Monday, the 27th of February, and tomorrow is the big day. So tomorrow we get into an important milestone in this journey with ASIC, because tomorrow is when submissions are finally due. If people can cast their mind back, it was supposed to be the 3rd of February. But then there were some conversations had with Senator Bragg, and it was suggested that people needed some more time. And I know that some people have taken advantage of the extra 4 weeks. But tomorrow is the day that submissions are finally due, and then we get into really the meat and potatoes of this inquiry. And what that will entail, Martin, is that we're going to see the committee start to accept submissions. There'll be some submissions which will be published. And then there'll be some confidential submissions that will be kept hidden. And so I'll be keeping a very close eye about my two submissions, my public one and my highly controversial confidential one, and then see if they are accepted by the committee, and then obviously see what happens to hearings. Now, given that the committee wrote to me in November asking for me to make a submission, I'm hoping and expecting to be called to testify, but obviously it's in the whims of the committee as to who they'll get to call as witnesses and how that process will unfold. But we haven't done a bit of a show in a few weeks about ASIC, and there's been a lot that has happened in the month of February that is worth entailing, because as we've gone through this journey, Martin, starting around August, September last year, there was a lot of people skeptical as to, well, what's going to come of this process. And so, this is not our last show. We're doing a couple more shows before you move to the UK. Yep. But for those that said, well, nothing's going to come out of this, there are some things that have already come out of this process, and we're going to call those issues today. And dare I say, I think we're going to see more interesting developments in the months and weeks ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, John, that there's quite a lot now of regular media coverage about ASIC, but almost none of it actually reflects the prime mover, which is your good self, right, for creating the momentum for this to all happen. It's funny how they don't want to talk about it.
Yes. Now, before we get into the developments about ASIC, because the ASIC chairman about a few weeks ago has announced a massive restructure of the enforcement function, which is what we've been focusing on, investigations and enforcement. And this is according to Chairman Longo, the biggest shake-up in 15 years. So we'll get to that in a second. But some extraordinary things happened in Parliament in the last 2 weeks, which is worth talking about. So if we can cast our audience minds back. So a week and a half ago was Senate estimates. This is where ASIC came before the committee for about an hour to take questions from the Senate Economics Legislation Committee on a whole host of topics. And Senator McGrath focused on the fact that ASIC doesn't like parliamentary oversights, and he was quite aggrieved by some of these public comments, and he really put the sword to Longo about former Commissioner Sean Hughes. But then it came to this really interesting thing, was that Senator Bragg, out of nowhere, and I had no knowledge of this, that he asked Chairman Longo about a letter. And he said, did you get a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury about an investigation into one of your commissioners? And for a short amount of time, they didn't want to answer the question. They squirmed out of it. They said, let us take it on notice. And Senator Bragg was quite aggrieved and said, well, these letters don't come up every day. If someone at the commission has been under investigation, surely you can tell the Parliament about that. Now, in the course of this 1 hour, when they came back to Senator Bragg, they actually decided to fess up, and Karen Chester outed herself as the person who was under investigation. And she said something which has now proven not to be true. And she said, quote, there was no adverse findings against me. So that was the statement at that time, a week and a half ago, and the minister at the table was Minister Gallagher, the Minister for Finance, basically endorsed that position. No adverse findings, so someone made a complaint, someone looked into it, nothing to see. It's time to move on. And so the big revelation of last week was that the ASIC revealed the letter, because Senator Bragg said, I demand to see the letter, so show us the letter. So the letter was provided to the committee, and ASIC was before another committee last Thursday where this issue came up again. And the letter actually said something very different. And the letter said, so this is from the Treasury Secretary to the Chairman of ASIC, that in many instances the allegations or the conduct was either was either wholly or partially substantiated. So now we don't know what the conduct is. So it could be Karen Chester looked at someone the wrong way one morning. That could be it, or it could be something more significant. So we don't know what the allegations were, but what we do know from last week was that the former chairman of ASIC, James Shipton, was one of the complainants. So you've got the former chairman of ASIC going to the Treasury saying that my deputy is a real problem and engaging in some form of unprofessional behaviour that triggered a formal investigation. And the investigation found that some of these things were actually did happen, but recollections and the significance of these events differ. So obviously now Senator Bragg, upon hearing about this and seeing the letter, went completely ballistic last week and issued an extraordinary press release. And that press release is sort of the premise of the title of the show, because Senator Bragg really has put a stake in the ground and is really going hell for leather against ASIC now, given what he's said in this thing. But before we get to the press release, one of the extraordinary things that happened last week, Martin, was that because this revelation of this letter showed that there was a different story, because the Minister for Finance basically accepted ASIC's versions of events and told Parliament there was no adverse findings, the Minister was forced to write to the committee last week and effectively retract her testimony. And so let's put slide 1 on the screen. So this is the letter from Senator Gallagher to Senator Walsh, who's the chair of the committee, and basically said that her statements to the Parliament was based on ASIC's assertions, and that was the best recollection that she had. And obviously there was no intention to provide inaccurate or misleading evidence to the committee. And so I've never seen something like this in modern times, that a minister writes to a committee and says, I'm taking back what I told you last week because I trusted the bureaucrats and they didn't tell me the full story.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? So and it also shows you that the politicians do sort of rely on what they're being told by those bureaucrats, right? And so if the bureaucrats choose to mislead, misdirect or whatever, there's no checks or balances. Indeed.
And even today, this morning, there's an article in the Financial Review by Karen Maley, and that article quotes someone in the banking system and saying that the chairman of ASIC has to set the example on disclosure and has to be, quote, whiter than white. So the fact that he and his deputies didn't provide full and frank disclosure to the Parliament, that has been seen around corporate Australia as a very big issue for Longo, and obviously it's a very big issue for Senator Bragg. So let's actually get to slide 2, because I fell off my chair when I read this, Martin, last week. So this is what Senator Bragg said in a press release last Thursday, quote, "Today we learn that ASIC may have misled Parliament. This is a very serious development. It could lead to ASIC being held in contempt of the Senate. This is a terrible position for the corporate cop. It is a laughingstock. No wonder ASIC is seen as a toothless tiger. There is a major problem at ASIC. The culture of the organisation is sick. I am also worried the government's minister at the table accepted ASIC statements without question, but has walked back her support today." Now, the reason why this is significant, Martin, is that Chairman Longo was asked last Thursday by Senator O'Neill about ASIC's culture. And he said it's a very good culture. So you've got the chairman of ASIC saying we've got a good culture, and now you've got Senator Bragg in a public statement saying it's a sick organisation, and that's well, sometimes you can say, well, maybe it's not the best, but to call it sick is taking political language to a new level.
It is pretty amazing, but it goes to form, right? This is something that's been going on for quite some time with regard to ASIC and their ability to sort of weave and dodge and frankly obfuscate. So it's good that politicians are finally calling them out, but it amazes me that the politicians have to do this, because basically what it says is at the heart of ASIC, we have a problem.
Well, I mean, and that's been the whole genesis of this whole campaign. There's been a problem with ASIC for 15 years. And maybe you want to spend a couple of moments talking about your late wife Jill's experience with ASIC, because she had, running her own business, she had up close and personal interactions, and your experience and Jill's experience was less than satisfactory.
Yeah, well, I will do this. And by the way, I've made a confidential submission because I didn't want necessarily all the details to go out into the public domain. But basically, Jill ran a financial planning business for a good number of years. She was a fully qualified financial planner before she went into law as an academic. And after she'd been working her business for about 3 or 4 years, suddenly she got a letter from ASIC, and they said they wanted to come and visit her. And so literally 3 senior people from ASIC visited her at home, because she ran a home office. I actually sat in on the meetings because she was very nervous about this whole thing. And they spent about 4 hours querying her about her business processes, her qualification. I mean, it was the most excruciating set of discussions. The fact was they walked away with nothing because she was running her business fine and everything was good. But the whole process to find that there were 3 senior people from ASIC sitting against one small business operator. She was a sole business operator, right? 4 hours. And I was horrified at that point, and this is a good number of years ago, but I was horrified that they would actually do that. The whole way they went about it, the assumption was that she was doing bad things, that she didn't have the right systems and processes and backups and all those things, right? That we were able to prove. They could have actually written her a letter, and she could have actually responded to a letter. But no, they turned up, cavalry, knocking on the front door, 4-hour conversation. And that really underscored to me personally that ASIC has no sense of priority, right? They pick the small people off because they're easy targets. They spend a lot of time and effort making up the numbers on the small guys whilst missing the big picture issues and the major corporates who frankly just walk scot-free. That's my experience, and that's the submission that I made.
So can I just ask you this, Martin? So when you say they focus on the small people, now, did they ever accuse Jill of doing anything?
No.
So
It was a fishing expedition.
Well, yes. So when you say they target the small people, they're not targeting small people who have engaged misconduct. No. They're just going, like you say, they're randomly trying to suss people out.
Yep.
Whereas when it comes to the big end of town, like the big banks, it was, we're going to look the other way for many, many years.
Absolutely. And, just to be clear, Jill had all the certifications, all of the various processes and systems in place. Everything was there, so there was no issue found. So, she got an all clear afterwards. But the whole approach, the whole basis, the whole assumption that they actually would spend so much time, and, Jill was obviously very concerned about it because she thought, well, maybe there's somebody's made a complaint, or maybe but no, there was nothing. So it was a fishing expedition. And for me, that really underscored that they don't have the right priorities, they don't have the right systems, they don't actually have the right orientation. And meanwhile, the big end of town just get away completely scot-free. And frankly, I think they make these small people targets because they can make the numbers. They can say, well, we did 400 investigations or whatever the number is, right? Much easier to do that rather than actually do the real hard graft on those big organizations.
Yes. So now, and the 2 points I'll make, Martin, is that according to my analysis, and I'm not sure when this conversation with ASIC happened with Jill, but it's gotten worse according to ASIC's own published numbers. But then the second thing is we get into what Chairman Longo announced, which was the biggest shake-up in ASIC's enforcement history in the last 15 years. So now, the first point to make up is that ASIC has now basically... So one of the things we said was we wanted heads to roll. Now, 2 senior executive leaders in enforcement have been basically let go. So whether they've been pushed or jumped, it's not entirely clear, but according to the Financial Review, two people have left, and that's Danielle Bird and Sharon Chisholm. And we'll get into them in a second. So, but then apparently Longo is going to do a complete restructure of the enforcement function. And what he said last week was that they're going through a consultation process at the moment, and this new structure is expected to come into place in July of 2023. Whereas they at the moment have the current structure, which is the Office of Enforcement, and that came in 2019. So the fact that they've got, because this is what they do, they go through these cosmetic so-called changes of restructure. But it doesn't seem that the performance of the staff seems to be any better. So what gives any confidence that this restructure by Longo is actually going to work? And only in the last week did the former chairman of ASIC, James Shipton, basically call for a breakup of ASIC. So he basically said that ASIC has too much on its plate, can't focus enough on the important stuff. So the enforcement function, so ASIC does a number of functions in terms of running registries and supervising the market, and then you've got the actual law enforcement investigation division. And he said that the law enforcement division needs to be broken off, so you've got the financial police separate, and then you've got people making up the rules and supervising the market over here, and that would work as a better structure. So you've got two, so you've got two chairmen of ASIC, the current and the former, basically saying, well, we need to make some big changes. And obviously one of the things is that the changes that the former chairman made is now being undone by the current chairman, and the current chairman's changes, whether they are going to work or not, that remains to be seen. But the question is that why is Longo now doing this now? And so he had a year and a half leading into the end of last year to make changes, and he didn't. And now he's decided to make the biggest shake-up. And so while the Financial Review and ASIC won't acknowledge it, dare I say, I think that this channel, my reports back in October, and the fact that there's 2 parliamentary inquiries into ASIC's enforcement function has put tremendous pressure on ASIC and Chairman Longo. And he felt that he had to respond. And obviously my view, and this is what I've expressed to people in Parliament, is that this shake-up is an attempt to blunt the inquiry. So if the inquiry does reveal any shocking stories, the reaction will be as well, that was then, we've got the message, we're in the process of fixing things, we're going through a restructure, we're able to move on. And I think that's going to be the refrain of ASIC and the chairman to say, well, we're not looking backwards, we're looking forwards, we're getting on with fixing things, and no matter what these so-called case studies are, we shouldn't dwell on the past. I mean, I think that's the political strategy. I'm not sure, particularly with Senator Bragg's new media release, that whether this strategy is going to work. But the inquiry is obviously going ahead, and there'll be hearings, and there'll be a number of people who have dealt with ASIC directly who'll be providing their experience to the Parliament. And it'll be very interesting to weigh up between ASIC's viewpoint and their justification for this behaviour versus what people on the outside, people like me, have experienced, and we'll see how that all lines up.
Well, I have to say, John, there's the old story about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? And often business restructurings are a demonstration of doing something, but with not really doing something, right? We'll restructure, but it doesn't necessarily change the fundamental cultural norms. Or, if you've got significant issues in the company, you can restructure to bilio. It doesn't make any difference, right? Sometimes you actually need to have a different leadership philosophy and maybe, dare I say, different leaders.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's very interesting you should say this about the different leaders. Now, the politicians tend to focus on the commission at ASIC, which is effectively the non-executive board, because they're the political appointees. And there's been a lot of change in that part of the commission over the last few years, with new chairman and deputy chairman and then being replaced and new ones being brought on. So in the last 12 months, we've seen a couple of changes. So there was Cathy O'Moore, who her term finished, and that was in July of last year. And now we've seen another commissioner leave in the last few weeks, who's Sean Hughes. His term was supposed to finish around September, October of this year. But he was asked, is he up for a reappointment? And Canberra said, basically that there's no chance you're going to be reappointed. So he decided to leave early and actually get a good plum job in another part of corporate Australia. So Sean Hughes has left. So there's a couple of gaps in the commission, and there's been some public commentary as to whether there should be some new appointments, or maybe Chairman Longer doesn't want new commissioners and he wants to concentrate power around him and Sarah Court. So there'll be a very interesting thing to see. But the thing that I've said to people in Parliament, Martin, is that it's not necessarily the commission that is the biggest problem. It's the next level down, is this so-called executive board. And this is the day-to-day operational management, executive management of ASIC. They're the ones that have been there for 20, 15, 20, 25 years, and they're the ones that basically set the culture and basically, set the tone of how ASIC actually runs. Now, this is what I've said to politicians: that executive board needs to be cleaned out, and you need new people on there. And so, what has happened is that, like I said before, Danielle Bird and Sharon Chisholm have actually been dismissed one way or the other. And just to show how, because again, people in this audience said, well, nothing's going to come of this inquiry. Now, just to show, if we can put slide 6 on the screen, Martin, is that, so what we have here is, this is according to the annual report of ASIC. Joanne Bird was on a total package of almost $400,000, whereas Sharon Chisholm was on $420,000. So these two individuals who have been at ASIC for quite a while, Sharon Chisholm's been there for about 15 years, they were on significant salaries, they had enormous responsibilities, and they're no longer there. And so again, do I think more people need to go? Absolutely. But at least one thing we can claim is that this whole campaign has resulted in at least 2 senior members of that executive board dismissed. And whether we'll see if they get reappointed and by who. But if we need new leadership, we are starting to see the early signs of that. And so I think these 2 sculpts are the first minor victory of this channel's crusade to save people from financial crime. And because these 2 people were senior executives in the enforcement function. Yep. So when people say there's not enough investigations, or the investigations are not generating enough fruits, well, these 2 people were the leaders. So now there's other leaders in that area, and so some of those other leaders are still there, but 2 of them have been gone, and we'll have to see what happens next. But I think it's a very positive sign that we are seeing moves by Longo. He gets the message now. There are people being dismissed. There is a process underway. Now, I'm skeptical that process is going to actually fix the problem, but I think as we go forward, we're going to see, the horror stories are going to start to come out, and those horror stories are then, I think, going to put more pressure on ASIC to make more changes, and it'll probably put more pressure on the government to actually get ahead of the political story and not leave things to ASIC's devices, and that's where I think we're going to see potentially more beneficial outcomes in the months ahead, and I think again, it's better to have done this than not to have done it, because I don't think nothing would have changed otherwise.
Well, no, John, I think, like I said at the beginning, your activity as a prime mover needs to be recognised here. I think also it's worth saying that I've got some big questions about what is or what should be the role and function of ASIC, what the objective should be. And I remind you, we discovered, I think quite recently, that one of their prime directives internally is to protect the interests of ASIC, which I find a remarkable primary objective.
Yes. So within the ASIC values and the ASIC code of conduct, one of the elements is that everyone has to act in the best interest of ASIC. So it's not in the best interest of law enforcement or Parliament or the people. They're there to protect the agency.
But self-preservation at all costs, right?
Yes. And dare I say, I've seen examples of behaviour. For example, senior people at ASIC speaking to the Financial Review on an unauthorised basis to smash Longo. We are seeing a whole host of unprofessional behaviour coming out of that organisation, and obviously we're always seeing people trying to hide investigations and the outcomes of those investigations. So that there's clearly a whole host of things really rotten at ASIC, and I think Senator Bragg's correct in his assessment, and I think. Hopefully we're going to clean out the rots, and there'll be more heads rolling, and we'll be able to fix this problem, which has been going on for at least 15 years. Now, the one thing I'll say to Martin is that we have a couple of shows coming up. We're going to do a bit of a farewell show this weekend, but then we have a secret show which we will release at a future point in time. So we're waiting on a bit of a trigger before we release that, and I think that show will provide some more context as behind our recent show about me facing the death penalty in North Korea.
Well, we'll watch and wait, John. Look forward to the next couple of shows as we count down towards my return to the UK. But I will just say, to my mind, the objective of ASIC should be in the interest of the people.
Exactly.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Martin North. John Adams, in the interest of people. We'll see you next time.